right, before I move out of the core of the Middle East, I need to say a few words about another demographic exception like Israel at the center of the Arab Muslim world, one that will have relevance to the Persian Gulf, the oil economies in a minute, so I'll make mention of it. All right. Now, you remember that remember the victorious European powers of Britain and France who got control of the Middle East, by and large, the core of the Middle East, got control of it from Turkey after World War I. We already talked about that. All right. And specifically, I put up here the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which, as you can see, meant that the British, in red and pink in here, and the French, got more or less control of the core area of the Middle East. All right? And as you've already seen in Palestine, with the Palestine-Israel situation, as you've already seen in Africa and elsewhere, the Western powers began to politically organize this area for their own convenience, with very little concern for the resident populations, and especially the Arab Muslim populations in the region. Against the will of the Arabs and Muslims, the European powers would establish the foundation for much of the political strife, not all of it by any means, but a substantial quantity of the political strife that you see today comes from this period of reorganization of the area politically to service Western ends. And I'll give you some examples of that because that'll resonate when we get to the Persian Gulf here. Now, looking at this French control zone here after World War I, in blue, the French, who were given control of the Muslim kingdom of Syria in here, this was a Muslim kingdom, and the French were given control of it. The French noted that there was a strong Christian population in the southwest coastal portion of it. You can see here, right? Most of this green stuff over here are Muslims, all right? Be they Sunni or Shia, all right? But you'll notice a reddish pink little area right there, and that's where you find Christians predominate. What the French did after taking over this area is the French sectioned off and created a new country called Lebanon, which you can see right over here. This was done in 1926. And when the French created Lebanon, it had, roughly speaking, a 50-50 population in terms of Muslim-Christian. Before, the Christians had been a distinct minority within Syria, Greater Syria, of course. But now when Lebanon was created, the Christians were roughly 50-50, more or less. And of course, what the French did, having created Lebanon in 1926, is they favored the Christian half of the Lebanese population, giving them more opportunity in the colonial regime. Now, the Christians became the economic and political ruling class, despite being or representing only one half the population of Lebanon. Now, the problem has been, though, this is in 1926, the problem has been that the Muslim population has been growing at a faster rate than the Christian population since 1926. But even as the Muslim population becomes a higher and higher majority percentage, they did not get a proportionate amount of political power to go with that. All right, political and economic power remained in the hands of the Christians, which were increasingly a minority. And this situation in Lebanon was going to be aggravated in 1948, when just south of Lebanon here, Israel was created out of Palestine. And of course, that meant you had multitudes of Arabs who were leaving Palestine as refugees because of the instability in Palestine/Israel. And of course, what would happen to these Palestinian Arabs? They would come into Lebanon, and of course, what would they see in Lebanon? They would see another Arab Muslim population that's a majority being displaced and ruled by a non-Muslim population, all of it sponsored by a Western power, in this case France. That's just what they left. And of course, they're going to be a little upset about what occurred to them. They go into Lebanon, that's going to only invigorate their resentment. And the heat was turned up further with increased hostilities between Palestinians and Jews to the south after 1948. There was the various wars that would occur right on through the 1967 war, which we talked about. By 1970, as you can see here in this upper map here, this map is showing you 2012 as a modern map, but by 1970, the Muslims were a clear majority in Lebanon, in this upper pie chart. And the Christians were a clear minority. And it's a little deceiving here because the Christians actually break down into smaller subsets. Nevertheless, they were a clear minority. Nevertheless, power still relied in the hands of a Christian minority overall. And so the stage was set for conflict, and it broke out in 1975. All right, you get the Lebanon or Lebanese Civil War. And the result would be that Lebanon would fall into chaos internally, especially the capital. The capital of Lebanon, Beirut, it used to be known as the Paris of the Middle East, and it became a shooting gallery as we moved through the latter portion of the 1970s. And by the late 1970s, as we come to the 1980s, Lebanon would become known as the country without a government. And it would last without essentially a government for the remainder of the 20th century. I mean, you would have various degrees of instability and infighting in Lebanon that would only really end in 2006 with the end of the Second Civil War. All right. But the point is that I want you to take note of, because it'll tie back in to an event of some profile in a bit. It is that Lebanon in the late 20th century was known as the country without a government. So much chaos and infighting going on. There was no centralized authority, or there were nothing but essentially armed in camps with various interests vying for power and privilege. All right, now keep that in mind. Lebanon becomes a country without a government. All right, so hold that in mind. I'll get back to it. Now, let's move out of the heart of the Middle East here. And if we look at the general Middle East over here, would anybody like to guess which would be the only country in the Middle East, perhaps with the exception of Israel, that is named after a man? And don't say Jordan in any case. Well, since I'm unlikely to get a response. The only country in the Middle East named after a man was this country right here. And that is Saudi Arabia. Saudi's Arabia was named after Ibn Saud, as you can see here. What had essentially occurred was there was a lot of infighting on the whole Arabian Peninsula in the early 20th century between different sheikhs and political leaderships here. And the winner would succeed in consolidating most of the Arabian Peninsula under one state. And of course, that's Ibn Saud, from which you get Saudi's Arabia, or Saud's Arabia. All right. In fact, the states on the remain on the Arabian Peninsula, the remaining states that you see here, these states were tribes in a sense, where their monarchs were not conquered by the Saudis. And so they essentially remained the sort of opposition to the Saudis in the early 20th century. And of course, they congealed into the states that you see today. Now, looking at the eastern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, let's have a look at the UAE over here, as you can see here. The United Arab Emirates is a confederation of 7 emirates, of 7 princedoms, if you would. I mean, it's a rather strange federation. It is, if I was to ask you, what are the two dominant emirates of the UAE, you can rather readily tell by looking at the larger cities. One is Abu Dhabi, right there, and the other is Dubai. All right? And you might be able to figure out why they're two dominant emirates of the seven. It's because, by and large, they contain most of the Federation's oil reserves, and you'll see the importance of oil in the Persian Gulf. Now, a few things about these emirates and a lot of these states here in the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula. Most of the countries on the Persian Gulf are culturally conservative Muslim societies, usually with an autocratic governance and control, often an absolute monarch, such as Oman over here, Saudi Arabia over here, Kuwait right off the map over here. All right? And that's certainly a fair description of most of the states. And it doesn't necessarily not apply to the UAE, but there's some other factors here you have to take into account. All right? The UAE seems to be suspended momentarily between a traditional pre-modern Muslim society with the cultural practices that go with that, suspended between that and a distinct modern, even a postmodern cultural set of practices. It seems to be suspended there. When I say suspended, it just means it's in a transition, and a pretty rapid transition, away from a traditional Muslim society. You can sort of infer that when you look at this photo over here, which has a surreal, commercial, and theatrical quality about it, in any case. But what I'm saying is, if you look at, say, a set of photos like this, you can infer what I mean. There's a mixture of pre-modern and modern aesthetics in here. With respect to Muslim values, put it this way, let me give you some examples. As a technical matter, penalties still exist, such as flogging and stoning, amputation, crucifixion still exists for various acts that range from adultery, premarital sex, alcohol consumption, and conventional criminality. You still find those penalties still apply. But you have to put an asterisk on those. Because in a modernizing society, it's difficult and increasingly infrequent to imply those things. They still are applied, but not generally evenly and with great intensity, because this is a modernizing society. I mean, in this society, you still have, nevertheless, as a technical matter, apostasy, by the way, which means giving up the religion, in this case Islam. Leaving the religion is punishable by death. Homosexuality, by the way, is still illegal. It's actually a capital offense. By the way, dancing in public is illegal. I believe holding hands is also illegal. But like I said, these are technical matters. These societies are experiencing rapid change, associated, of course, with oil revenues. That means you essentially indulge in the consumer mass media, which brings in aesthetics and values which flood in and you can't stop. This means that this society rapidly becomes a consumer culture because they produce little more than oil, and most people aren't working in the production of oil. Not only do they produce oil, but of course, since you're generating a lot of money producing oil, they become a banking center. That usually means high salaries. So you have a rising standard of living, and that exposes this traditional culture to the temptations of consumerism. That is central to the Western experience. Therefore, at the same time, you have those traditional restrictions, the compromise of those values with consumerism of the largely stem coming from the West is also evident. Because consumerism promotes the acquisition In fact, what am I talking about? Consumerism just promotes acquisition of things, of services. Consumerism does not promote historical group values through conformity. Consumerism does not do that. Consumerism promotes commodified expression and display. It does not promote, in fact, it eschews modesty, humility, or restraint. No, consumerism can't function with those values. Consumerism only promotes the expression of self through purchases, so as to sell as many and different products put forth by competing marketers. Consumerism promotes nonconformity. And therefore, consumerism diffuses those who would presume to have cultural authority. Their authority is diffused, and it's diffused away from things like the church or parents in favor of the market and its mass media mechanisms and wisdom, if we want to use that term with regard to consumerism. As suggested in the lower left photo over here, traditional lifestyles that are still within living memory of many older UAE citizens, they simply become commodified experiences for tourists. Not a lifestyle possessing organic and historical values that promoted environmental harmony, collective betterment, or balance. No. The combination of resource wealth and small populations in these states on the Persian Gulf means that, in the western portion of the Persian Gulf, means that the high standard of living requires a massive infusion of foreign workers in the construction, service, and consuming sectors. If you have a society that's converted quick and all of a sudden finds itself in the possession of expendable capital to indulge oneself, well, a lot of people aren't going to want to do the lesser attractive jobs, certainly the lower paying jobs. They don't have to. And so you're going to need a massive infusion of foreign workers, like I said, in the consuming sectors and service sectors and things like that. So have a look at this graph. It's sort of an interesting graph because what it shows is an amazing statistic. Look at the UAE here at the top, and it says immigrants account for what? The vast majority of these societies' populations. In the UAE, 88%, roughly speaking, of the population are non-citizens. Same thing with neighbor Arab countries, as you can see over here. The majority are non-citizens who have come here looking for work, and there's plenty of opportunity. They have a work contract to be in the country. Conditions and the treatment of these necessary outsiders can be unpleasant in times. They're clearly second-class citizens to be charitable. Thus, you can see why trying to maintain traditional Sharia law, shall we say traditional Islamic law, with all those restrictions I mentioned that refer to a pre-modern society, is damn near impossible, especially with a multicultural throng of people coming here which are necessary for the society to function. You can see some photos I put in here of, unfortunately, conditions are often less than perfect. Per capita spending a day in the UAE, roughly speaking, is about somewhere around here. I think in stats from 2014, where that about average per capita spending is about $27 a day, which is 8 times higher than the rest of the Arab world. That's how elite these societies have become, and rapidly. And like I mentioned, the UAE is almost a pure consumer society, not a production society. Is almost a pure consumer society, as they import, by the way, 85% of all the goods they consume, producing very little domestically. Consumer spending has become a real problem in terms of personal debt, as the savings rate is extremely low. The average family, after housing and basic food, spends the majority of its income on luxury goods. As sort of suggested by these status commodities, keeping up with the Joneses type of spending is a real problem for a society that presumes some semblance of Islamic values. I mean, what does it tell you that Michael Jackson when beleaguered by scrutiny for his, shall we say, peculiar relationships with others and animals, fled to the UAE and its ostensible conservative Islamic culture. Sort of instructive in terms of the role money plays, even in a conservative society like this Islamic culture. So this is an interesting society in the sense that it's a society of capitalist ostentation, even though often in conservative dress. Nevertheless, such you get things like this, the Burj Khalifa. All right, here is the tallest building in the world. I haven't checked lately. I believe there was one being built in Shanghai. I don't know if it's completed yet, but I think the Burj Khalifa is still the tallest. It may have been displaced already. You want to have a building like this because they're trying to show their status in the world, and having the tallest building in the world, more than the developed countries, taller, is a technological achievement, and it brings prestige to what is an obscure state to most Western perceptions. You get other capitalist ostentation in this dry, hot desert region. You have an entire indoor winter skiing slope in a shopping mall. It has the UAE has some interesting coastal developments, which some people question the wisdom of, as is suggested here. The country has been altering portions of its coastline by creating artificial offshore developments, based on, as you can see, aesthetic designs of some sort here. All this to service elite luxury lifestyles. So you can see how consumerism, which has been entirely successful at converting all preceding cultural forms on this planet to its matrix, so to speak, is equally at work here in the conservative Muslim Persian Gulf. In fact, if we just move up, we were just talking about the UAE, if we just move up to this country over here, this is Bahrain, a small island state. It's an independent state. All it is largely is an offshore oil platform for Saudi oil. And you might say, well, fine, well, why point it out? Because given the rather culturally conservative region by and large, peculiarities down here aside, Bahrain is particularly liberal. If I had time to talk, I'll rely on your imagination, but sailors who from the West who go into the Persian Gulf often like to go to Bahrain because it's a place that you can find some of those distractions, shall we say, both consumable and aerobic, that sailors often indulge on shore leave. Well, Bahrain's the place to go from the Persian Gulf. Anyway, nevertheless, in fact, I had to put this picture in here. It's sort of amazing. All right, it's Islamic, of course, but Bahrain is well, it's as you can see, it has the world's largest underwater theme park. I mean, this type of strange development is indicative of a culture that is received a lot of wealth in a short period of time, and that, of course, has to do with oil, the oil industry. All right, now we need to move up into the Persian Gulf oil fields.